Good afternoon and welcome to Jerusalem. We would like to start, please. Hi. On behalf of the Chaim Leption Center for Middle Eastern Studies, for the Islamic Studies, I'm pleased to welcome you here in Jerusalem. And what we have here for you today is a series of 3 lectures on the theme of victims of history, those meeting the suffering of the other, influence reconciliation. We're supposed to have 4 lectures, but Kobi Kabalek apologized. He's ill and therefore will not be able to join us today. So we'll have 3 talks by our colleagues at the Vrije University on the topic that I learned is the topic of your visit here to Israel, and then you'll be meeting students from the Vrije University, and you'll have a short tour to the Vrije University. As I told the organizers, we had a conference here this Monday on feminism and women's movement, Palestinian women's movement here in Israel. And what we still have from that conference is a exhibition at the main library. So you'll be taken to that, a very small but very beautiful exhibition. And without further ado, I would like to present the first speaker. What we'll do, I guess, is have 20 minutes for each, and then questions at the end, if that's fine with you. I think we have a nice variety of speakers who will be speaking about very different topics. Our first speaker is my colleague at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Hillel Cohen, who will be speaking about Zionist and Palestinian narratives of the conflict. Can they meet?
Hi, shalom. Palestinian and Zionist narratives of the conflict, can they meet and can they serve us for reconciliation, the meeting between the narratives? Now, of course, what we should start with is what is a Palestinian narrative and what is a Zionist narrative, in order to ask ourselves, can they meet or not? Now, I don't know, how many of you study Middle East studies? No one. So I guess you know everything, because nobody changed your mind at the university. But if we speak about the basic issues of Zionist narrative and Palestinian narrative, I think we can say that the main differences between these 2 narratives are in 4 points. One point is, what is Zionism? What Zionism is? What is it about? The second point is, which is very important if we speak about what happened in history, is a question what happened in 1948, the year of the establishment of the State of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian disaster, the Palestinian refugee. What happened in that year? So this is the second question, which there is a huge debate about it. The third question under debate, which relates also to the first 2, is who is the victim? Who is the victim in this conflict? And who is the aggressor? This is a basic question, of course. And there is a 4th point, I think, is what is peace and what is reconciliation? Because the question of peace and reconciliation is not seen the same way by Israelis and by Palestinians. So I think I speak about these 4 points in order to show how difficult it is to reconcile the narratives and, of course, to reconcile between these 2 people or 2 nations. So what is Zionism? Zionism for Israelis is very, very different than Zionism for Palestinians. For Israelis, Israeli Jews or Israeli Zionist Jews, which are the majority of Israelis and the majority of the Jews, Zionism is, of course, the national movement of the Jewish people. That's for sure. But it's not only the national movement of the Jewish people, it's also the movement that aimed to rescue the Jewish people. Because if we go back to history, to the years of the establishment of the Zionist movement, the Zionist movement was established at the last quarter of the 19th century. And it was established under very dire conditions of Jews mainly in Eastern Europe, but also in Central Europe. And as you probably know, as Europeans, the situation of the Jews in Europe deteriorated in the years to follow the beginning of the 20th century until the Holocaust in the 40s. So for Jews, the idea of Zionism is based on two or maybe three components. First of all, a national movement. Second, a movement that is aimed to rescue them from their suffering and persecution. And third, it is a movement that helps them or push them to return to their ancient homeland. So this is very basic, and this is how most Jews today feel about Zionism, that this is, of course, a just movement. Why a just movement? Because it's a movement that came to rescue people from danger of death. Now, for Palestinians, of course, they view Zionism in a totally different way. Because for them, what is Zionism for Palestinians or for the Arabs in general, but mainly for Palestinians? For Palestinians and Arabs, Zionism is a movement that targeted their homeland and made all efforts in order to take the land that belonged to them and established a Jewish state instead of and in place of the Arab communities of Palestine. So if we ask a Palestinian what is Zionism or what is feelings towards Zionism or what the word Zionist means to them, for them it's of course I would say one of the most negative terms in their political dictionary. And indeed, one cannot ignore the fact that this is what the Zionism did. Zionism came to Palestine, the Zionist movement came to Palestine, became stronger and stronger with the help of the international community, and managed to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. And at the very same year of 1948, when the Jewish state was established, most of the Palestinians, or a bit more than half of the Palestinians, became refugees. And the rest of the Palestinians became under first Jordanian and Egyptian rule, and then under Israeli occupation. So this is the situation that we live now. That half of the Palestinians are refugees, and the rest of the Palestinians are under Israeli control or occupation. So, of course, from the perspective of a Palestinian, Zionism cannot be a positive term or positive movement. And since I mentioned the year 1948, so the question is, what happened in 48? And here again we can see, actually we can see it in every stage of the history of the conflict or the history of the relations, that there are two totally different views of what happened in each stage. But 1948, because it is a central year that shaped the map of the Middle East and shaped the conflict, I'll say a few words about 1948. Again, if you ask an Israeli, almost every Israeli Jew, what happened in 1948 and why was there a war in 1948? Because in 1948 there was a war, first between Israel, before the establishment of Israel, so we should say, before the war between the Jewish forces in mandatory Palestine, in Palestine, pre-48 Palestine. So at the beginning it was a war between the Jews in Palestine and the Arabs in Palestine, and then there was Arab invasion of the Arab armies into Palestine in order to prevent the establishment of the Jewish state. And this is a war in which the state of Israel succeeded to push out most of the Arab forces to establish the Jewish state and to evacuate 80% of the Palestinians who lived in the areas that became the state of Israel. These are more or less facts. But again, these facts, we have to understand how different people see them. And we have to go back, and in history, it's always a question, when we go back, how much we have to go back, to where we should go back. I'll go back to the point from which most Israelis tell the story. And they tell the story, of course, there was a Zionist movement. The Zionist movement came to establish its settlements in Palestine. They managed to bring more and more Jews to Palestine. And in 1947, the Jews were about 1/3 of the population of Palestine. The Arabs were 2/3 of the population. Then, at that time, the Palestine was under the British mandate. And the British mandate, the British government decided to end the mandate, meaning to end the mandate that they received from the League of Nations, or the United Nations, what became the United Nations, and to bring the question of Palestine back to the United Nations, meaning that Britain said, we cannot deal with this issue anymore, this issue of Palestine. We cannot govern this country. We ask the international community to decide what to do with this country. Now, the United Nations sent a committee. It was called UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, and this committee came with, the majority of the committee came with the idea of partitioning Palestine, to create in Palestine two states, one Arab Palestinian state and one Jewish state. The response or the reaction of the Arabs and of the Jews was very different, because most of the Jews and I would say the political leadership of the Jews accepted the idea of partition and establishment of a Jewish state on about 55% of the territory. And the Arabs rejected the idea of partition and establishment of an Arab state on the rest, on about 45% of the territory.
Who was representing the Arab population back then?
The Arab population was represented by, it was called the Arab Higher Committee. It was a committee based on the political parties that existed at that time in Palestine. It was very problematic. The leadership was very problematic, and the relations both with the international community and with Zionists was very problematic, because the head of this movement, Haj Amin al-Husseini, he collaborated with the Nazis during the war. And he became a persona non grata for the Europeans, I mean for the Allies. So the Britain refused to negotiate with him, and there was another body under him, under his influence, but he was not one of the representative, the official representative, but he was the head of the Arab Higher Committee. So here we come again to the difference between the Palestinian narrative and the Zionist narrative, because in the Zionist narrative, the Jews, or the Jewish agency was a representative of the Zionist movement. They accepted the decision of the international community, and the Arabs rejected it, and they announced that they are going to launch a campaign against the new Jewish state. So, for Israelis, the establishment of the State of Israel was based on international legitimacy. For the Arabs, what happened in 1947 in that decision is something totally different. First of all, a couple of states were bribed by the Zionists and the Americans in order to vote for the establishment of a Jewish state. But this is, let's say, a minor fact in history, because many decisions of the United Nations are accepted either by pressure or by, usually it's not a mere bribe, but in this case there was also money from hand to hand. But the main point for the Arabs is that the Arabs say that the United Nations does not have the legitimacy to take a country and partition it and give half of it to another nation. I mean, they are majority in this country. How come that the United Nations can decide about the fate of this country against the will of its population? So this is the first point. The second point is that the Arabs demanded that the question whether the UN has the right to do it would be brought to the International Court in The Hague. And the United Nations refused to do that. So they claim that because the UN refused to do that, it means that this resolution was accepted without international legitimacy. So this is the second point. And then the war started. What does it mean the war started? Again, we have a couple of ways to understand it. There is no debate that the first shots were shot, or bullets were shot by Arabs at Jews. But when we speak about war of more than 1 year, we can see different stages of escalation. You have in many cases, you have opportunities to contain the war, to contain the hostilities, and you have also the opportunity to escalate. So, who escalate and who try to contain, this is also under debate. And a main debate is about the flee of the Palestinian refugees. What made them flee? What caused them to uproot, to be evacuated from the villages? So usually, or most of the Palestinian narrative in general would say the following, that the Zionist movement from its very beginning, when they came to Palestine, their aim was to evacuate the country from its Arab inhabitants. And they waited until they will have the opportunity, and the opportunity came with the minor hostilities that started after the UN resolution. According to the Jews, or to let's say the basic Zionist narrative, the Zionists came to Palestine in order to live in peace with the Arabs. But because of the Arab armed struggle and the Arab use of violence, they didn't have any other way but to defend themselves. And sometimes when you defend themselves, you use power. When you use power, you use the force that you have. People are afraid of you, and people are, they run away from their homes. And because the fleet of the Palestinian refugees was in circumstances of war, and because they rejected the establishment of the Jewish state, it means that it was their fault that they left their homes, not the fault of the Jews. Meaning, if they had accepted the partition plan, they would have remained in their villages and cities and neighborhoods and so on and so forth. So they are to be blamed for their victimhood. So, please.
Do you think that most of the Palestinian population was aware, to this extent, of what was happening?
If they were?
If they were aware to this extent that they could move, or that there would be Jewish rule over them, or I don't know how well communication was.
Yeah, I think in the 40s the Palestinians were fully aware, maybe not all of them in the same degree, but they saw for 30, 40, 50, 60 years the development of Jewish settlements near their villages, near the cities. They saw the Jewish immigration, and they knew very well about the intention of the Jews to establish a Jewish state here. So it was kind of common knowledge. And of course, most of them rejected it. Now, why most of them rejected it? Because they didn't want to live under foreign rule. They wanted to live under their own rule. So here we can see. So if you go to back to the War of 48 and you ask, who was the aggressor? Who was the aggressor? So the Zionists would say, of course the aggressors was the Arab. Why the Arabs? Because they rejected the partition plan and they started the war. The Arabs say, no, we're not the aggressors. We lived peacefully in our homeland. And the Jews came and started to establish their colonies and their settlements. What can we do? We went to the international community. The international community didn't want to hear us. Why they didn't want to hear us? Because they didn't want the Jews in Europe. They wanted a solution to the Jewish question in Europe. And what's the best way to solve the Jewish question in Europe? To establish a Jewish state in the Middle East, to push the Jews of Europe, because there were hundreds of thousands of Jews in Europe that were homeless, were refugees, and internally displaced persons in refugee camps in Europe, in Italy, in Austria, in other places. What can we do? We don't want them. Let's establish a Jewish state. So, and you can see also countries with history of severe anti-Semitism that voted for the Jewish state because of this reason. They didn't want Jews. This is the best solution. So the Arabs say, yeah, so we are not the aggressors. We only tried to defend ourselves from Jewish immigration. So you can see, and we can see it in most conflicts in the world, of course, that if you hear one narrative of one side, you can be fully convinced in his or her story, because it's very convincing story. The Zionist story is very much convincing. You know, it was a people under persecution with the ancient homeland. They came back to their homeland. They agreed to the peace solution of the international community. They were forced to war, and they won the war. You cannot blame them because they won the war. And if you hear the Arab-Palestinian narrative, it also makes full sense, because they lived peacefully on their homeland. Waves of immigrants came to their homelands and tried to establish a foreign rule on them. Of course, they rejected it. They tried to reject it peacefully and in diplomatic ways. They didn't succeed. They tried what every people under occupation tried to do, to push out the colonizers, to push out the aggressors. So they are the victims, and the Zionists are the aggressors. So we have here two totally different versions of history, very basic. And now to the fourth point is, and this is my last one, the different views of peace and reconciliation among Jews and among Arabs. Because if you ask, let's say, the most radical Muslims, if they support peace or against peace, of course they would say, yeah, we support peace. Salam, peace, is one of the names of Allah. Yeah? And Muslims, they want peace. If you ask radical Jews, do we support peace? Of course we support peace. We pray for peace 3 times a day. Everybody wants peace. So if everybody at least says that he or she wants peace, why there is no peace? Because the meaning of peace is totally different. For Jews and for Arabs, peace is not the same. Because for Arabs, peace means also justice. And for them, justice is that they will be against the rulers of their homeland. For Jews, peace meaning to live peacefully in this very homeland, which is the homeland of the Palestinians. So it's not exactly the same. And also the question of reconciliation. I mean, okay, let's reconcile. Many times you can hear many Israelis, if you ask them if they want peace and reconciliation, they will say, yes, sure, we want peace and reconciliation. I made a survey a year ago among Palestinian students for education, 280. And they have to, I asked them to grade between 1 to 7, to what degree they want peace. Nobody wants peace. Nobody wants peace. Even the word peace for them in Palestinian political dictionary became a dirty word, because all the peace negotiations, all the Oslo process that led the Palestinians to war situation and so on and so forth. So the idea still exists, but the word received a negative meaning. But this is not the whole story. I think more important is the fact that for Palestinians to reconcile with Israel and with the Israelis means that they accept what happened in the history of the last 100 years, meaning to accept all what they rejected for 100 years, to accept the Jewish immigration to Palestine, to accept Jewish presence in Palestine, to accept all the building of Jewish settlements in Palestine, and to accept Jewish sovereignty in Palestine. So even if Israel or the Zionist movement says, okay, we agree to everything that you can propose. We agree to equality. We don't want to be occupiers anymore. We agree to the idea that this state would be the state of all its citizens. Full equality, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 vote. Full equality to everyone. For the Israelis, of course, it's not easy, for many reasons. We can discuss them later. But it is part of what the Zionist movement claimed that it wanted from the very beginning. Because when the Zionist movement came to Palestine, they said, we want to Palestine, we want to establish a Jewish community in Palestine that lives in peace with its neighbors. So this will be the fulfillment of the Zionist idea. But for the Palestinians who struggled all the time against Jewish immigration to Palestine and against building of Jewish towns and settlements in Palestine, to agree to reconciliation means that all what they did for 100 years was a huge mistake. That all their struggle, all the national struggle, was going in the wrong direction. And also, there is difference between if we accept the Palestinian narrative that see the Israeli Jews as colonizers. If you take colonies everywhere in the Third World, of course the colonizers, they want peace. What means peace for them? That they can walk in the streets of Algeria, of Morocco, of Indonesia to walk peacefully and nobody would attack them. But what is for the locals, for the colonized, what is peace? Not to see anymore these people who came and destroyed our homeland. So it's not even the same meaning of the same word. Because if you have two states that were in war between them, France and Germany, for example, so they can reconcile. And everybody sits in its homeland as it was before the first war between them. But when you have debate on the same country between a nation which is indigenous nation and another nation that again claim to be indigenous and that this is its ancient homeland, like the Jewish people, but is seen as a colonizer, the colonized cannot accept reconciliation with colonizer. Take Rhodesia as an example. They want to kick them out. They cannot be here. So in order to, and here I come to the question of narrative and reconciliation, in order to use narratives and try to help us reconcile between them, first of all, the narrative, the Jewish narrative of its roots in this country should be part of the story. Because if we ignore the Jewish roots in this country, the Jews indeed can be seen as colonizers. But if we take the history, not only the new one, but also the ancient one, and we accept, happily or sadly, but the Jews do have roots in this country, and we cannot view them as mere colonizers. In such a case, of course, you can say, okay, this is not a war between colonizers and colonized, but between two nations that they have rights and they have roots in this place. So this is, I think, one of the keys. We need a lot of keys in order to solve the conflict, but this is one of the keys, the acknowledgement of the rights of both people in this country, not as colonizers, not as immigrants, but as people with roots here. Thank you. רוצים לשאול עכשיו.
Do you want to take questions now?
Yeah, I think it's better.
So maybe 10 minutes and then
According to the question.
Okay.
8 minutes.
I was wondering about, like, in the Zionist narrative, it's a very important fact that the Zionists accepted the United Nations partition plan, right?
Yeah.
To justify, not being the aggressor, not being the colonizer. Then why does Israel at current times not obey this partition plan?
Yeah, this is a good question, but this is politics. If they are, you can ask the same about the Palestinians. Why now they accept the declaration of the UN, for example, about the right of return, but they didn't accept the partition plan of 1947? So the answer is very basic. You always accept what is good for you. This is politics. It has nothing to do with the core identity question.
How do you think that even if a lot of Palestinians will accept that maybe the Jewish people here are not colonizers and they have their roots here, etc. Because I think that in our discussions, especially with Palestinians, one of the big obstacles seems to be the acceptance of the Jewish identity of the state and the kind of maybe in the end not all, that most of the things that might be a bit unequal now will all be equal, but for instance the incentive to keep a majority of Jewish people here, which will probably then also mean that people with non-Jewish roots, for instance with immigration, will have less chance to immigrate. How can you as a non-Jew then very much also identify with a state, or how do you envision that kind of, I guess, identity clash if you're not Jewish, especially living here?
Yes. You know, the political program of the Palestinians in Israel, or the political platform, is to, the suggestion is to see, or to transform Israel from a Jewish state to state of all its citizens.
Oh, sorry?
To a state of all its citizens.
Yeah.
So to change the definition of the state from a Jewish state to a state of all of its citizens. This is problematic from a Jewish Zionist perspective, mainly because it means that the Jews will not have a state of their own. Now there are many, it's quite popular to have, you know, think tanks about this kind of issues, and I participated in a couple of teams that dealt with it. And for example, I can say that one very banal idea is to define the state, instead of the Jewish state, to define it the state of the Jewish people and of all its citizens. So, meaning that you play with words, but it should have also a legal meaning. For example, in the realm of distribution of land, which so far, you know, most of the land is given to Israeli Jews, to the Zionist movement, and not to Palestinians. So there are transformations that can be done without harming too much the feeling of the Jews, that they have also the right of self-determination.
Yeah, I think you gave a good overview of the two narratives, although I do have my doubts on whether in the last aspect of peace and reconciliation, whether the general narrative is that Palestinians really don't want to see any Jewish culture in their land, because people we spoke, I think, are open to that at this point. But my question was, these are two completely different social realities which are internalized completely, if I may say. What's the next step then? How do you think you can meet? Does it help to meet that one?
Yeah. Look, the question whether the Arabs want to see Jews here or not is a very interesting one, and there is no simple question to it. I'll tell you just a small story. My kids, they study in a Jewish Arab school in Jerusalem. There's one joined Jewish Arab school in Jerusalem. I have 3 kids in this school. Now, because I'm a historian and I speak Arabic, so I participate in meetings of the teachers. I'm invited to speak about this kind of issues, like narratives and how to deal with these issues in class. So there was a story that I was told about 2 kids, 9, 10 years old, that they had a debate in class. And the teacher, an Arab teacher, told the Jewish kid, if you are not satisfied, you can go back to the place you came from. Now, my kid, I was born here. My mother came from Poland. My father came from Afghanistan. And my kids, of course, were born here. Now, kids, you know, 90% of the kids in this age, they were born here. But the idea that many Palestinians still have, that you can go to the place you came from, go back to Europe. Usually it's Europe. Why Europe, I don't know. But because, yeah, of course, the main source of Jewish immigration before 48 was Europe. So this idea is very strong, even among people who are devoted to reconciliation and coexistence. Because this teacher is part of our team. It's not someone who came from Hamas or from Daesh to say go back. No, she is part of our team of Jewish Arab school, but is so rooted in the new generation. It was not so in 2 generations ago. She's young, she's 27, 28. It's so rooted that the Jews are foreigner here, that she can say it as a matter of fact. Of course, there is a huge difference between the political discourse and the daily discourse. Because in the political discourse, you don't say it. You say, yeah, two-state solution, if you are Abu Mazen or whatever. But in the political discourse, a Jewish person is not a curse. But in Arabic, Yahudi, a Jew, is a curse. It's the same with in Hebrew about Arabs. It's not unique. I don't know if it's only because of the conflict or also because of other reasons. So I say it is true, and it is also true that the conflict is internalized, and people behave in a certain way because they are in conflict and because of power relation between them. And we are much stronger. So in a sense, if you ask what can bring into a change in power relations, a change in power relation, like Iranian atomic bomb or whatever, I don't know. You asked them a lot of questions. If there are no one else, of course, I would like to hear a question. You can tell someone your question, and she will ask.
I find it quite interesting that a lot of the things we hear is kind of has an undertone of the Jewish state is here, it's not going to go away, just accept it, and then we can kind of move on. While I think for many people that are under occupation or are resisting against stronger power, most of those narratives are not really about and then I might use a bit like rude words for that just because I don't know the exact subtleties of English, because the oppressed people just gave up and were like, oh yay, my ruler, let's just stay here and that's all okay. Most of the stories, especially in occupied territories, at one moment there comes a big revolution and the oppressors at least take a big hit or whatever. And the same like with the Jewish diaspora, like the whole story. I mean, Jews have, not many people were very nice to them, but then they organized themselves and they made a country and they got very big. So I can very much understand, especially in narratives about suppressors and oppressed, that for Palestinians, like, why should they give up? That's not like how it's supposed to go. And I don't know exactly what my question is, but why? No, but I find it interesting. Also, kind of from a Jewish perspective, you've been oppressed like what 3,000 years basically, and then you made it happen. Not like this, but it happened. Is that very much like kind of the Jewish? I don't know. I mean, of course, like I think there must happen a lot. Will the Palestinians grow so strong or get so much Arabic support that they will rise up against Israel and put all the Jews in the CE? But I can understand why Palestinians do not want to,
Yeah, I do understand
up.
as well. Yeah.
So why do you then, maybe as a historian, maybe you also know a lot about uprisings or whatever, say that the Palestinians should accept just that the Jews are here and that they have their roots here? I think it would be better, maybe, but for peace. But
I don't say that they should do it.
Okay.
I just say that this is the only way to reconciliation. They cannot decide that for them we are colonizers. They don't want to see us here, and let's wait until they will be stronger. Okay, fine. If this is the attitude, we will say the same, and we say the same. I mean, this is the current situation that they say that we are colonizers. I mean, I don't, again, not in the political discourse. The political discourse to state, okay. But in the popular discourse, yes, this is what they say. You do not belong to here. We wait until we will be stronger. And this is in the Islamic discourse here. This is what people tell me. I mean, okay, so now you are stronger. We know the truth. We know that Allah is with us. So it will take 2 years, 4 years, 20 years. At the end, this country would be Islamic country, and Al-Quds would be the capital of the Islamic Caliphate. Okay, what can I say? Let's see. I cannot say anything else. I can go back to my rabbi and he will say, no, it's bullshit, because the Messiah is going to come and it will be a Jewish, only Jewish. So, please.
I was intrigued a little bit about your remarks about the different definitions of the word peace. But in my mind, I'm thinking the definition of a word relates to the context where you are living in. What I mean to say is, I have in the Netherlands had a lot of discussions with people, for example, from the Palestinian embassy. I shouldn't call it embassy, I know, but
you should.
Representative of the Palestinian Authority is the formal definition, who told me that the real problem is that they are open for discussions and they really want to talk about peace, but the starting point should be that there should be justice.
Yeah.
And then start talking about
Exactly.
peace.
Exactly.
But how does this statement relate to your remarks about this different definitions?
I tell you, one rabbi of mine, he said, and he wrote, I really want peace. Peace is part of Jewish religion. But what does it mean, peace? Peace means, and he wrote it also, peace means that the Jews are superior to the Muslims. Why? Because the Jews are the sons or descendants of Sarah, and the Muslims are descendants of Hagar, and Hagar was a slave, and Sarah was the real wife of Abraham. So peace means for him that the situation would be according to the divine will. This is peace for him, and the divine will is that the Jews are superior. Now, in Palestinian discourse, exactly as you said, peace is about justice, and about justice to the Palestinians, not about justice, a general or universal justice, because there is no such a thing, universal justice. If you take these two narratives that I presented, both of them are just. But if you reconcile with them and you say, okay, you have to compromise, there is no full justice to this and not full justice to this. So there is no full justice in the universal way of it. Like if you have storm, it's not just that my cousin was killed, but it happened. So there's no full justice. So what we have here, we have a Palestinian demand for justice for Palestinians. It's not peace, it's justice for Palestinians. It's not reconciliation, it's not peace. Now, this is, let's say that I fully support justice for Palestinians. What can I do? Can I evaporate? What can I do? So all this idea of full justice is not, it cannot be part of political settlement and agreement. It's vision, but it cannot be part of settlement, because you cannot reach full justice for Jews and for Palestinians.
May I have a small remark to this one, and then I will stop there. The cynical and almost tragical part is we have visited also a few Palestinian universities during our trip. We went to Birzeit, to Hebrew University, and I think when they would hear your lecture, they really would be very happy and say, well, you are completely right. But the tragic is they don't want to listen to your lecture. They don't want to have to do anything with you, because their ideas, we have talked about these kind of things for about 20 years, and now we don't want to talk anymore, and we just want to boycott them and wait till the resolution comes from itself. Right?
Yeah, I understand what you say.
And tragical.
Yeah, it's not. It's almost true, but I must say that I was asked to talk in video conference with the university in Gaza, and I was asked to talk in Bethlehem and in every place. So it's not. I mean, there is a declaration of boycott, but many people do still want to hear and to listen and to discuss. Sorry, I took too much time, and thank you very much.
I very much enjoy listening to Hillel anytime, and I completely sympathize. But we still have two speakers, so our next speaker. Okay. You decided. Okay. Okay. He's reached, which is fine. It's their decision. So our next speaker is Dr. Tamar Hess from our Department of Hebrew Literature here at the Hebrew University. She'll speak about it. The title of her talk is They Will Say We Brought the Nakba, Agency and Responsibility in Israeli Literature about 1948. Really follows up on some of Hillel Cohen's ideas, I believe.
No.
No?
Or not.
But,
I'm sorry, there it is. I just want to show you a few pictures. But,
So thanks for inviting me, and thank you for that. It was very interesting. Although I think I agree with you less than the rest of the audience. But it's not my it's not my discipline, so I can't argue that way. Let me get this on. Down here. There. Okay. Great. So I'm not a historian, but I'm a historian of literature, and I want to speak today about one representative of modern Hebrew literature, modern Israeli, contemporary Israeli literature. I want to tell you about Yoram Kaniuk, the author Yoram Kaniuk, born in 1930 in Tel Aviv, and he died 2 years ago. In these photos, you can see him as a young man right after the War of Independence, and see how good-looking he was at the time. And at the end of his, toward the end of his days, I'm mentioning his good looks because they're very much part of his image and self-image as an author. He's the best-looking one, right in the middle. He's right in the middle. We could argue that, I guess. So I'll give you my my bottom line, and then I'll try to elaborate it. I want to think or present Kaniuk's writing as a position which represents a very main position in Israeli culture altogether, and Hebrew literature specifically, but in Israeli culture in general, and that is a position which maintains a position of victimhood, of being a perpetual victim, as a position which enables shaking of responsibility, or a lack of responsibility. So maintaining the position of a victim in Israeli culture enables a skirting of responsibility generally, and Kaniuk is a fine example of this in his work. That's what I'll try to show you. So I said Kaniuk was born in 1930 in Tel Aviv, and his parents were very much founding characters of Tel Aviv and of Israeli culture. His father, who had immigrated from Berlin, but wasn't originally from Berlin, but posed as a German Jew, came in the 1930s to 1920s to Tel Aviv and became the personal secretary of Tel Aviv's mayor, Meir Dizengoff. He was a central cultural figure. He helped found the Tel Aviv Art Museum and orchestrated concerts. Very, very well-known figure. He was very close friends with Bialik. Chaim Nachman Bialik was Israel's national poet, still a very well-admired figure. And Bialik was Yoram Kaniuk's godfather and gave him his name when he was born. On his mother's side, he came from a Russian family, a Russian Jewish family, who immigrated to Ottoman Palestine early in the 20th century, right after the 1905 pogroms. That was what brought them here, and she experienced violence and in national contexts and clashes, and had seen Jews being murdered by Palestinians in the early 1920s. So Kaniuk was part of this family, and you would think that he would feel that he was a native Israeli, being or proto-Israeli, having been born here. But Kaniuk tells us that he did not want to be a native Israeli as a child. Rather, he tried to imagine himself as a German Jew. In the 1930s, German Jewish children who had no choice immigrated to mandatory Palestine, and they had beautiful clothes and toys and lovely accents. And Yoram Kaniuk tried to reimagine himself as having been born in Berlin. He memorized all of Erich Kästner's children's books, and he knew the map of Berlin by heart through the books. He knew every street and could walk in Berlin of his imagination and relive himself as a German boy. He practiced saying, the Israeli children, when they get hurt, they say "I." but German children say ow. So Kanyuk the child tried to train himself to say ow instead of I, and devised a game with his father. His father would punch him in the stomach, and he would practice saying ow instead of I. It worked. He learned finally. When he was 17, Kanyuk lied about his age and joined the Palmach, the pre-state military organization in pre-state Palestine. And he fought in what was called by his contemporaries the Butcher's Arena. That is the area surrounding Jerusalem and inside Jerusalem, the road to Jerusalem. If you came here on the road, you saw the vehicles that Kanyuk was trying to guard as a young soldier on the side of the road. You can still see them. So he's part of what is in Israeli collective memory, in Israeli Jewish collective memory, mythological battles of 1948 and turning point battles of the war. There are two traumas that shape Kanyuk's narratives and his prolific writing. He published a lot, and he retells two basic stories. One of them is a biographical story, and one of them is an adopted story. The biographical story is his trauma as a young soldier in 1948 in the battle. The adopted story is the Holocaust, which, like many other Israelis, he adopted into his biography. And these two memories merge in his writing. In 1961, I think already published one. Well, I'm not going to get the year right, and I'm not going to look for it now. But one of his,
Yeah, I'm confused. What does adopting the Holocaust mean?
I'll explain. One of his early novels, Adam Resurrected, is about a Holocaust survivor in Israel. It describes the state of Israel as a collective madhouse in which you hear shrieks and yells at night because everyone the whole country has survived the Holocaust and has nightmares at night. And after this book was published, he was invited, he describes in a different later book, he was invited to participate in a reading in a private house in the town near Tel Aviv, Ramat Gan. He comes to this private house, and at first his hosts are all Holocaust survivors, and at first they treat them with suspicion because he's not one of theirs. Obviously, how can he describe the Holocaust experience since he's so well grounded as an Israeli native, born here? But then they start talking about Auschwitz, and he corrects one of the women as to the number of the blocks in Auschwitz in which she was imprisoned there. And there's a discussion among them, who is right, the survivor or Kanyuk? And then her husband thinks about it, and the rest of them think about it, and it turns out Kanyuk is right. Okay? So then they adopt him in that way. He's internalized it as his experience. What I'd like to suggest is that this is not a personal neurosis of Kanyuk, but that he represents a very strong a very strong strand or thread within Israeli culture. It's not a thread; it's a pillar of Israeli culture, adopting this experience. Now to go, I want before I get back to his experiences of the Holocaust and of 1948 as a soldier, I want to talk a bit about his poetics as an author. Kanyuk, I'll say this differently. Israeli literature, if we look at it, is developing in generations. The first generation of authors who wrote in Hebrew and were born in mandatory Palestine were called the generation of the Palmach. They served as young people in the Palmach, and they published their writings about at the same time. Kanyuk should belong to this generation because he's their age, and he was at the right age to already start publishing his stories when they were publishing their stories. But he did not join his biological generation in literature. He only started publishing in the 1960s, and the first book he published wasn't even in Hebrew. It was in English. After 1948, I think he must have been traumatized. We can imagine that he was traumatized by the war. Having after a brief episode of helping bring refugees from Europe to Israel on ships, he left to live in the United States for a few years and became a painter. he wrote an autobiographical book about this period called Life on Sandpaper, translated as. It's not a very interesting book, but it has a lot of name dropping in it. He met practically every famous person living in New York during those years: Charlie Parker, many dancers. But that's not what I want to tell you about. What I wanted to show you is I'm showing you the cover of his first book published in English, The Acrophile. The acrophile is the lover of the extremes, of the edges, and that is what Kanyuk's poetics and perception of life is. He is a writer of extremes, of opposites. He's very difficult to peg down as saying one thing, because in every sentence you'll find the opposite, and in every paragraph we'll say the opposite of the one before it, and you cannot peg him on one position. He'll always be saying one thing, and it's complete opposite, and in very high emotional altitudes of extremes. So this kind of poetics was characteristic of the 1960s in Israel and not of his biological generations. In that way, Kanyuk was always a misfit within Israeli culture. After he published in English, he started publishing in Hebrew, but he could never really fit because biologically he belonged to a different generation, and poetically he was writing like a different like the generation that was publishing in the 1960s. He saw himself as a misfit that could never fit. This went on until the 1980s, about when Israeli readers changed, and then Kanyuk became very, very popular. And what I'd like to say is that his popularity also has to do with his answering exactly onto a emotional need of Israeli writers, and that goes back to Israeli readers. Israeli readers viewing themselves as victims within Israeli culture themselves. So to go back to the two traumas I was describing, of the Holocaust and of 1948 as a soldier. Kanyuk participated in several very bloody battles. One of them is the battle in April 22nd, 1948. It's the Battle of Nebi Musa. I think I have a picture of Nebi Musa for you. Yeah, outside Jerusalem. Probably in. I'm not sure if I'm getting maybe that way or behind us, but I'm not sure. Beyond the green line right now. It would be. We're sort of here, I think, on the picture right now. About. The Palmach tried to conquer Nebi Samuel and failed miserably. Kanyuk describe this failure, and in a story which was very provocative for his the period he published it, he wrote about how his commander in the Palmach deserted the soldiers that were fighting in this lost battle outside Jerusalem and ran away and left them on the field. And Kanyuk writes about how he and his peers left on the field are trying to avoid Palestinian shooting, and they lie on this deserted field for an entire day, pretending to be dead, with fire going on above their heads until it gets dark enough to run away. The vultures are there. The name of the story is Vultures because some of the soldiers are dead already, and there are vultures there. This story is based on biographical events, but it's a story that is fictional. It was published originally as a fictional story. Kanyuk's writing was accepted as not fictional by his authors. An example of this is that this story of vultures is quoted in a historical description of the Battle of Nebi Samuel in an historian's book about the brigade that Kanyuk was fighting in the Harel Brigade. Kanyuk retells this story in many of his works. So, in his view of 1948, he is the victim. His victimhood also surfaces in stories in which he relates violence toward civilian Palestinians, and that's what I want to get to now. For example, in one of his stories published in a book which was very popular a few years ago, and there's an equivalent to the Booker Prize in Israel, the Sapir. So Kanyuk's 1948 won the Sapir Prize, which is a mark of how well it was accepted by Israeli readerships. in 1948, or Tashach Kanyuk relates how he accidentally kills a child in a Palestinian village in 1948, and shoots him by accident, and then tries to prevent his friends from killing the child's grandmother and mother as well. They both get murdered, the two women. And when Kanyuk tells the story, the traumatic side that we experience as readers with him is his colleagues and his peers holding on to him and not permitting him to defend the two women that are about to be murdered. So the trauma that we are held with is his helplessness, trying to prevent his peers from doing violence rather than the violence inflicted on the civilians in the story. And I want to read you a part of his writing, published in a book called Postmortem that was published in 1992, of Kanyuk, the child the young man before 1948. So that starts here. One day, it's my translation, I'm sorry. This was published in French, if any of you read French, but not in English. One day, I went with friends to what was then known as an American bar in London Square. London Square is in Tel Aviv. They sold ice cream specials in that bar. It was 1947. Shots were heard across the street, and then shouts. We paid no attention. We ate specials. We were used to it. Suddenly, a group of people chasing a man appeared. One could see he was bleeding, even from where we were standing. He fell under a street lamp on the corner of Allenby and Hayarkon, and a puddle of blood spread around him. His sudden collapse seemed to spoil the chase for his persecutors, and they looked disappointed, stood bewildered, and did not know what to do. They looked at each other in search of affirmation for what they were doing, because evidently they wanted revenge, to be just, and they resumed hitting him, but the blows were already dampened, and they searched for the anger. The young Kanyuk begged a policeman who stood nearby for help. When my nagging got on his nerves, he said, "Look, you sweet little mama's boy. Look, you Arab Astikin Tsukil. That one there is dead anyway, so one more blow or less won't make a difference." I'm skipping a bit here. I climbed through the dunes and came home. Sarah, his mother, noticed my fallen face as soon as I walked in and asked what happened. I did not answer. I went to the toilet, threw up, and came back to the room. She gave me her suspicious look and asked why I was pale and what had happened to me. I said I'd seen Jews lynching. Sarah rose alarmed and asked if I had been hurt. "I won't get any sleep tonight," she said in her penalizing voice. She spoke in her tragic misery octave. I was tired, and her words hurt me. The tears that had been in me surfaced in my eyes. I shouted at her, but she kept on going. She did not understand what I was going through. She did not want to. She was irritated over her son's well-being being endangered. She said, "You should not have gone there." I said, "How dare you? What kind of a person are you? A dead man lay there. They kicked his teeth. A woman spat in his mouth." And Sarah said, "I saw a row of bodies twice in my life. Don't you preach me. Bad things happen. Why weren't you considerate of others? You could have been hurt." Suddenly Moshe, this is his father, this introverted man, huddled in his scheme of habits, rose, approached, and touched me. It was an intimate gesture, and I was unfamiliar with. He said, "People don't do such things. It is a disgrace, Sarah. Bastards." He turned pale, as if artificially, partially ironic, partially devastated, and stared through me until his gaze reached the dead Arab left within me, and he turned to Sarah and said, "He's a grown boy, and he is seen as a disaster." During the war, after my friends died next to me, the commander decided to send me home for a day. An armored vehicle was sent to Tel Aviv to get someone. There was a blockade, and the cars and buses did not get through. Moshe and Sarah were amazed to see me. I sat in a chair for 24 hours. I did not eat. My clothes were blood-stained. I sat silent and staring. Sarah said, "Moshe, he must talk. Make him talk." My father raised his voice and bellowed, "He will speak when he has something to say." He came nearer, stood over me with the sudden generosity that Sarah's words stirred in him, more in defiance of her than in support of me. Only I didn't care. He said, "He will be quiet as long as you like." And poor Sarah asked if I'm angry at her, and don't I love her any longer, and don't I know what terrible nights she has been going through. I looked at her. I remember I did not know exactly who she was and why she was bothering me. I did not budge. I was an outcast and dazed, and she sat opposite me and tried to elicit words. I pursed my lips and kept silent. In her pain, she did not exactly know what shock was. She had been cast in iron and stale bread, and I in beeswax. After 24 hours, I left for the central bus station. The armored car was waiting for me, and we took off. So, these same events are retold again. This is from what I read you was from Postmortem in 1982. These events are told again in 1948 in the 210 book. Now, both books are autobiographical, but in later description, when the same Lynch is told, we're told that there's a specific date. It doesn't have it at a certain time. It happens in October 1947, which is a month before the UN's decision to end the British mandate over Palestine and establish two states. In Postmortem, there are shots heard, the truth that I just read you, but not so in 1948. In 1948, there's a policeman actually who is active and tries to catch the Palestinian that is running away, and uses a derogatory Hebrew term. He says, "This is the Arabush who fired." Okay? He tries to catch him. He's not a passive onlooker. Now, Kanyuk himself, in this autobiographical scene, has a different role. He actually tries to come in direct contact with the persecuted man, and I'm going to quote from that. He said, "I wanted to help him. He pleaded and cried and said in Hebrew that it was not he who had fired the shots, and that he had got caught there by accident. I believed him. He looked wretched, confused, and miserable, but they did not want to believe him. A real enemy had fallen in his hands." In this version, Kanyuk physically lies on top of the Palestinian being chased, and when he goes home and the Palestinian has been killed, he is drenched in his blood when he returns. So he makes himself more active in trying to defend it. But I think both scenes share in common. I think you can hear it when we read this, that Kanyuk visualizes and experiences himself basically as the victim of both scenes. Basically, it's not the man who has been killed, but the person who witnesses the killing who is the victim. And Kanyuk, I think, became so well accepted and loved within Israeli culture because he answered this very urgent need for Israelis to envision themselves as perpetual victims, an image that can maintain their moral position as aggressors. And that's about it. Thank you.
Yesterday we had a meeting with Yehuda Shmon from Breaking the Silence at our hotel. I found him personally one of the most inspiring speakers ever I've heard, and rarely I've witnessed such silence as when he was speaking about his experiences. And when you were telling us about his life, it sounded to me as if his work, parts of his work, is his breaking the silence testimony.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about this idea, and is this what I think it is? Was this his breaking the silence testimony?
I think he saw it that way, but I think more so it's a glossing over of the silence. I think breaking this. Well, I'm not a political analyst. I do literature, so it's a difficult question to review. I think breaking the silence are going against the grain of Israeli culture more so than Kanyuk did. Popular culture is defined by answering and affirming values of its readers, and I think that Kanyuk was popular in that he answered an Israeli need actually of glossing over violence rather than breaking the silence. They break the silence. I'm not sure. I think Kanyuk actually used possibly the rhetoric trope of breaking the silence in order to do something which is in my eyes was more morally problematic. Yeah, mm-hmm.
This theme, this topic of, let's say, the eternal victim,
Mm-hmm.
is it part of the work of more Israeli authors, or is it very special for Kanyuk that this
Mm-hmm.
issue of
Yeah.
victim is so important?
Israeli literature is very varied. You can find everything. So I wouldn't want to generalize as to everything, but I do think it's a dominant voice, yes, of authors that are of authors that are popular. Necessarily, yes. I mean, he's a very representative voice in that.
I think, for example, Amos Oz.
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. I think Israel too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But then I might be, but that's my personal view of it. I'm not sure every literary historian in Israel would accept that position. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering, as you said, he has been doing a lot of horrible acts himself.
And
I heard that he was doing a lot of horrible acts himself in the military,
Yeah.
for instance, 1948.
Yeah.
But in the book, he describes himself as a bystander or a witness of those horrors, and therefore considers himself a victim. But how does he then justify his own actions?
When he participates in violent acts in combat, he very often describes himself rhetorically as a victim, and his memoirs will describe very often the horrible conditions in which Israeli soldiers were at the time, without being able to shower or eat or go home. He will and another literary technique he adopts is that some of his stories are like tall tales. For example, in one of the tall tales are exaggerated stories. For example, in the Battle of the Kastel, you drove back. You must have driven past it when you came to Jerusalem. It's a battle, a turning point in the battle over Jerusalem. He describes how a bullet hit his eye. His eye spilled out in his hand, and then he put it back in. Okay, so this is something that you'd see in a cartoon. Okay, so very often he'll tell stories that are so extreme that they're not trying to be realistic, and then that's one way he shakes off responsibility from heavens. But he does, and he will usually be the victim of his commanders, or describe himself as the weak person in the combat.
And do you think that he was actually intending that, or that he viewed himself actually as that, or that he was kind of mocking the idea of victimhood with overemphasizing being a victim?
A literary text always has much more than an author intended it for there to be in it. So it's difficult to answer how much is in the eye of the beholder and the reader and the interpreter, and how much was. I mean, he might deny everything I've just said. He has a chance.
The Israeli community took it as more of a justification.
I think so. Yeah. He's considered a hero. Yeah, go ahead.
So another question. How is I know in the Netherlands, Jewish community, there is like World War II is still quite present. It's very small. Most of the local Jewish neighborhoods. I see it in my dad. I see it in my Jewish friends that they're. Well, Israeli conflict is not like really present there, but a lot is told of like people want to live specifically in houses where Jewish families lived in the Second World War. Like it's very present in our identity still. And what you said about like the victimhood, I can imagine like if you moved here around 1950 from Eastern Europe or from Europe, that identity of the victim is very strong, and that it can also give you excuses in some way. But is that victimhood identity transferred like intergenerationally and has like transferred to being in the military, or how, like, what is the point where that is not so much held on to, or because like Yehuda yesterday said that only about 2 or 5% of the Jewish population actually serves in combat, which is quite a small percentage as a nation to identify with them. So how is that? I wouldn't say being kept alive, but why? So much vague questions. How do you really like see it in education or in daily life? This kind of victim identity.
I'll say. I'll try to answer that in several ways. Well, 1948 specifically, as for the percentage of combat soldiers in combat, 1948 is a distinct, distinctly traumatic war in Israeli history because a whole generation, 6,000 men were killed, and Jewish men were killed in 1948. It was traumatic. A whole generation of young men simply died in that war. So the percentages of participation were different at the time. The grounds for the basic trauma are there. As for the Holocaust or the Shoah in Israeli culture, personally, my mother's a Holocaust survivor, so this is very much part of my life and my identity. But what I'm speaking about now is not the personal memory and trauma, but how it functions in culture, in Israeli culture and writings. And what I was trying to speak about is how it's employed politically, how the memory is employed politically, and it's very much ingrained into Jewish education from a very young age. Hillel mentioned his children. Shoah in Hebrew. I think my daughter was 3 years old when she came home and announced that tomorrow is going to be Yom HaShu'al, which in Hebrew means the fox. Shoah sounds like fox in Hebrew. So before they even know what it means, they are already noting the Memorial Day. And of course, it should be probably that way. But what I was trying to show through Kanyuk is how it's manipulated politically.
Do you think he was a political, or was he a political writer? Like what is the difference between?
That goes back to what did he mean? My personal disciplinary position is there's no such thing as a discourse that's not political or a political neutral zone. So.
I don't see it, so I don't know how it is. But does his narrative also get used in politics? Is it something that, I don't know, it's part of the canon in high schools that you should read his books, or?
That's a good question. I'm not sure he's read in high schools yet. It might have changed, but I'm not that fully aware of what is read in high schools. Go on.
Do you have one last question, or should we move on to our last speaker? It takes us to a very different geographical okay. The last speaker is our friend Dr. Samir Ben-Nayashi, who's part of the European Research Council project on history of the Holocaust, but he can tell you more about it. The topic of his talk would be the social response of Jews and Muslims to Vichy and the Nazi occupation in North Africa during World War II. And maybe you can start by introducing the larger project anyway.
Shall I do that? Shall I speak a little bit about the project?
Just
okay. So let's.
2 sentences or.
Okay, because okay. So let's start. I'm going to read this paper, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the project. It's maybe about. Let's talk a little bit about me. You know, I'm a Moroccan student. I came like 15 years ago to do my studies here, so I stayed here. And now I'm working at the Vrije University. You know, in Morocco, they always say don't send Moroccans anywhere because they don't come back. So I actually, I proved this theory. So I wrote a dissertation on colonialism and medicine, how the French, how the French colonization in Morocco used medicine to colonize North Africa, especially Algeria and Morocco. But now here at the Hebrew University, I just started a new subject. It's not actually my field of specialty. It's North Africa. I know what happened more or less, but the World War II and the Holocaust, because there were some Nazi working camps in North Africa. So that's the subject that I'm dealing with. But, you know, I'm trying to see how the Muslims also looked at this history. And I'm trying also to integrate this episode into the Moroccan history, which means when they are thinking about their history or their histories during the World War II, I would like them one day to mention this episode that happened in the work camps, and which is supposed to be a Jewish episode, but I think it's a North African episode shared to Muslims and to Muslim North Africans and also to Jewish North Africans. So this is more or less the background of the talk. So on May the 5th, 1940, France, anyway, I think I lost one. This one actually, I don't know, something happened to the PowerPoint that doesn't. No, this one it should be here, but I don't know why it just was spoiled in. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So it just vanished. One of the pictures vanished, but I will tell you what's that. Okay. So on May the 5th, 1940, France was conquered by the Nazi Germany. For the North African people, the colonizer France was colonized. For North Africans, this meant that the powerful France was defeatable. So what would this assumption mean for North Africans, Muslims and Jews alike, who lived then under the French colonization? On June 22nd, 1940, Marshal Pétain, the guy we see here with Hitler, Marshal Pétain, or Marshal Philippe Pétain, the famous French general from the Great War, signed an armistice with Germany. The arguments divided France into two equal parts. They are not. The picture is not here. It vanished with this. But this is Algeria. It's not France. It was here. Actually, what was here? It was the occupied zone and the so-called free zone, south of France. You know. But this picture is a little bit more or less. I'm sure you saw it in textbook. In high school, it's very famous picture, so you didn't lose anything. So the armistice divide France into two parts, two unequal parts. The northern part of the country of France, the occupied zone, went under the direct control of Germany, whereas the southern part, the so-called free zone, was granted to Maréchal Pétain, who moved his government to the small city of Vichy. Pétain and Vichy government retained France's overseas possessions in the Caribbean, Africa, North Africa, Middle East, Indochina, Vietnam, and in the closest French colonies to the metropole France, that is North Africa. Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. That was how North Africa fell under the control of the Vichy pro-Nazi regime. On October the 3rd, 1940, the Vichy government enacted its first anti-Jewish law that was inspired by the 1935 Nazi anti-Jewish laws or Nuremberg laws. The law was extended to Algeria because it was considered, Algeria was considered part of the French mainland, like Corsica, let's say. Berlin had never asked the Vichy regime to extend the 1940 anti-Semitic law to North Africa. That was a pure innovation of Vichy to show Berlin that they were good students of the Nazi ideology. In this pursuit, on October the 7th, 1940, the French government revoked the French citizenship of the Algerian Jews by the abrogation of the 1870 Crémieux decree. Crémieux, or Adolphe Crémieux is this guy. Ironically, the fact that, the Crémieux decree, granted the French citizenship to the Jews of Algeria in 1870. So, the decree that granted the Algerian Jews the French citizenship collectively in 1870, ironically, the fact that the Algerian Jews lost their French citizenship avoided them a systematic deportation to the Nazi extermination camps in Europe. The Algerian Jews who were deported from Algeria to the extermination camps in Europe were the European Jews, but not the native Jews. On the other hand, there were several native Jews, native Algerian Jews, who had French citizenship, immigrated to France, to work and live there, but they were caught and then they were deported to the extermination camp from France to the extermination camp on the European soil, but not from Algeria. Apart from the deportation, the other restrictions that were valid for French and or European Jews who lived in Algeria or passed through it remained valid also for the Jews of Algeria, even after they had lost their French citizenship. Things didn't stop here. In March 1941, a special commission led by Xavier Vallat. This guy, he has something on his eyes, but he's not Moshe Dayan. So a special commission headed by Xavier Vallat was formed to deal with Jewish affairs in France and also in North Africa. Xavier Vallat made an official visit to Algeria in the same year to make sure that Vichy anti-Semitic laws were implemented on the ground. Vallat, by the way, was behind the new 1940 amendment of the law that worsened the anti-Semitic law even further. Hence, the Jews of Algeria were defined as Jews by race. I called race because I'm adopting the language of Vichy, but because I don't believe that there is a race. But so they were defined by race according to their parents and grandparents, regardless if they were practicing the religion, Judaism, or not, converted to other religions. Even if you convert to Islam or to Christianity, or even if you are atheist, you are defined as a Jew. In Morocco and Tunisia, which were considered as two protectorates and not colonies like Algeria, there in Morocco and Tunisia, the Jews were defined as Jews according to their belonging to the Jewish community, and not by their race or their Jewish descendants. The colonial status of Algeria as French department and Morocco and Tunisia as two protectorates, French protectorates, played an important role in the fate of the Jews in North Africa concerning their persecution, internment in the labor camps in North Africa, and their deportation to the concentration and extermination camps on the European soil. Like in Europe, with like in Europe with European Jews, the Vichy regime in Algeria sought to implement the Aryanization on the national economy and all the Jewish property. Article 5 of the June the 2nd, 1940 was promulgated in 3 North African countries in order to exclude Jews from the liberal professions. And numerous clauses or quota system. Would you wait just for the question until I finish? Because I'm reading and it...
Were you friends? Were you deported if you were practicing?
I answer everything at the end of the talk. So a numerous clauses, quota system in English if you want, was created to limit the number of Jewish lawyers, medical doctors, dentists, midwives, notaries, artists, architects, to only 2% in every profession. Within the framework of the Aryanization, Jews were banned from the following professions in North Africa: banker, money changer, intermediary in transaction in the stock market, advertising agents, real estate, dealers in business, and similar types of properties. Even gambling or operator, publisher, director, the film director, managers, copywriters, even as a local correspondent of newspaper or periodicals, except strictly scientific or religious publication. The law stipulated, I quote, to eliminate all Jewish influence from the national economy. This measure did not apply to structures and apartments used for personal lodgings, but only to the property that was exploited for business purposes. The French colonial authority tried to put the Jewish properties in the hands of the French and Muslim administrators who would manage their properties. Muslims were tempted to volunteer and to run the Jewish businesses as a way for reparation for the confiscation of their properties and their lands by the French in a recent past. However, many imams, especially in Algeria's mosque, many imams and religious authorities warned against this abuse and considering it an illicit act like a betrayal or stealing act to stop Muslim from volunteering to be manager of the Jewish property. On the contrary, there were a multiplicity of cases where Jews made fictive transactions with their Muslim friends and neighbors to escape the Aryanization. However, in almost all the cases, the French authority would discover this arrangement and not recognize the transaction. In general, Muslims had abstained from volunteering to be administrators of Jewish properties. In all Algeria, there were only 11 cases of Muslims, according to the French sources, who became administrators of Jewish properties. The 11 cases, all of them were retired functionaries who worked in the French colonial public sector, in railway, or in social security. After the abrogation of the Crémieux Decree in Algeria, Vichy ordered the full implementation in Morocco and Tunisia of the numerous clauses, or the quota system, and Aryanization of Jewish property. In these two protectorates, the Jews did not have a French citizenship, but were dhimmis, or dhimmi subjects, of the Muslim authorities, the Bey and the Bellical authority in Tunisia, the Sultan and the Sharifian kingdom in Morocco. Generally speaking, the Aryanization did not work in Tunisia, thanks to some integrity of Jean-Pierre Esteva, the French resident general in Tunisia from 1940 to 42, and Ahmed II Pasha Bey. this is and also his successor, Monsef Bey, I don't have his picture here, who under this situation did everything to gain time. That was important, and postpone Vichy decisions. The Aryanization was not introduced to Morocco, also thanks to Sultan Mohammed bin Yusuf, known later on as Mohammed the Fifth. Mohammed V here and with Nogues, and the resident general Auguste Nogues, who did their best to circumvent the Vichy's commands. In the Moroccan case, Sultan Mohammed V's behavior during this period remains the subject of much debate. In the Moroccan Jewish popular consciousness, he is remembered as the one who refused to hand over his Jewish subjects to the Nazi. He is famous thanks to his sentence, "There are no Jews in Morocco, there are only Moroccan subjects." It was probably his sentence to the Vichy regime when the Sultan was asked to present a list with the names of all the Moroccan Jews. Even if we suppose that was a myth and that he had never said that this sentence, for both Moroccan Jews and Moroccan Muslims, he was the protector of the Jews, and this plays in the mind of and also in the reality as far as the relationship of the two social groups were concerned. In both private and public space, Mohammed V sought to reassure his Jewish subjects of his continued protection, since it was a religious duty within the framework of the Dhimma, the physical protection and freedom of cult that Muslim authorities should provide their religious minorities with. The Moroccan Sultan signed almost all the dahirs or decrees that permitted the introduction of old anti-Semitic laws that had been promulgated by Vichy concerning French Jewish citizens, also in the metropole, but also in the colonies and the protectorate. The Sultan signed even a decree prohibiting Moroccan Jews from hiring Muslim maids to work in their household. These decrees were presented to him by Nogues, the general, the resident general of France in Morocco. So the question here, how one can explain this paradox, like signing, but he's perceived as the protector of the Jews. The Vichy French resident general Nogues had a good rapport or had good relationship with the Sultan, and the two men made a good tandem in their negotiation with Vichy. Their strategy can be summed up as follows: accept Vichy's anti-Semitic edict and then negotiate their exact language to make them fit the Moroccan reality, thus softening or reducing their impacts on the Jewish community. Nogues' arrangements focus on the practical effects of these decrees. For example, the prohibition of the Jews from working in number of professions that they had monopolized would, for example, paralyze the country's economy. The Sultan's focus was on his religion duties, namely as commander of the faithful, he was obliged to protect all his subjects, Jewish subjects, but also Muslim subjects. Otherwise, he would lose his legitimacy as commander of faithful. The negotiation with the Vichy authorities were ostensibly over the form and the language of the law, but in fact resulted in avoiding its full application. Moroccan Jews would continue to be defined by religious affiliation and not by race or descendants. Moreover, the prohibition against Jewish professions and quotas regarding Jewish students would not be applied to those working and studying in Jewish communal institutions. Those whom the Sultan could not protect were French and other European Jews living in Morocco, in Morocco, of course, but not Algeria. Ironically, Moroccan Jews who had succeeded in obtaining French citizens, the Sultan could not help them. The initial disappointment and stress among Moroccan Jews was acute. The French, whom they had received with open arms in 1912 and whose culture they had quickly embraced, turned out to be anti-Semitic. Ironically, it was their dhimma status, which they didn't like, that turned out to be a crucial factor in their survival. Indeed, the protection of the Sultan and other Muslim notables was solicited by some Moroccan Jews, a reversion to pre-colonial behavior. As for the other restrictions and hardship, both Muslims and Jews were disadvantaged in the distribution of ration food and most other essential consumer products. In southern Morocco, in the countryside, in the Anti-Atlas, many epidemics broke out, for example, cholera and typhus. The drought caused a horrible famine that was not a natural catastrophe, but because France and because the colonizer exported most of the agricultural products to the metropole and to the war zones. In some villages in southern Morocco, the famine was so bad that some Moroccan sources mentioned some cases of cannibalism. People opened fresh graves and ate the flesh of the people who died of hunger. These events had been omitted from the collective memory and the annals of the official history. They are not celebrated, remembered, or commemorated in any way. They are not connected to World War II and the atrocities that coincided with this war and with the occupation. The final aspect of this episode was the detention in labor camps, the forced labor camps. A Vichy law of the 4th October 1940 had provided for detention for foreign nationals of the Jewish race. That was the language of the law. In special labor camps, that's the way the law termed them. North Africa under Vichy regime did not escape from this law, which included foreign agents, political suspects, communist militants, and also Muslim North African nationalists and political activists who opposed French colonization. The Vichy regime in North Africa took advantage of these labor camps and their detainees to achieve an old colonial dream, building a trans-Sahara railway that was supposed to connect Nice in South France and Dakar in Senegal. There's some picture from the labor camps. In these camps, to clear the rocks, lay the tracks, and mine the considerable deposit of coal and ore near the route, Vichy dispatched more than 7,000 unwanted to desolate corner of western Algeria and eastern Morocco. Most were political prisoners and various circles: Spanish Republicans, communist socialists, anti-Nazi Germans, they were there also, Gaullist and fascist Spanish, and local Muslim North Africans. About 2,000 of them were forced to work 2,000 of the forced worker were Jews. Vichy forced these people to sign contracts classifying them as wartime labor conscripts and were shipped towards southward in packed trains from the ports of Algiers and Oran, and there were packed or harsh in desolate camps. There, they worked from dawn to dusk with little food, water, rest, or medical care, gathering, breaking, loading, and moving rocks. They built stone barracks for their French overseers. Camp personnel consisted of former officers of the Légion étrangère. Most of them were Germans. The guards were Senegalese, the littérailleurs sénégalais or sharpshooters, and also were North African Muslims or Goums or Gommiers. They were among the guards of these camps. The camp of Bizerte in Tunisia was the only camp that was guarded by SS guards and was reputed as the cruelest camp because Tunisia was occupied by the Nazis for 6 months from November 42 and then until May 43. North Africa Muslim mainstream opinion regarding the war in Europe was resolutely pro-French, and many Moroccan Arab and Berbers youth fought in the French army to liberate France, braving the cold European trenches in the hope that France would in return grant them independence. Moroccan and Tunisian Jews, although identifying with France, were absent from this formative experience. Moroccan and Tunisian Jews were actually they didn't help France in this war. Unfortunately, Moroccan and Tunisian nationalists failed to explain to their public that many young Jews had expressed their will to join the French army, but the French turned them down as a matter of principle. Meanwhile, the period from the 40s to November 42 was one of the worst times in the history of North African Jews, for they suffered under Vichy regime and were seen by Moroccan Muslims as traitors because they didn't enroll in the French war, and then they didn't care about whether France will give Moroccan the independence or not after World War II. That's it.
Thank you very much.
We started a bit late, so we have about 10 minutes for questions. I think the interesting part for me in Samir's project is an attempt to introduce this chapter in Moroccan history into Moroccan historiography, into Moroccan public discussion, rather than a detached historical research, but part of an attempt to acknowledge this part of his nation's history.
It's a vague question.
It's a vague question. I think it's a really more specific. Why? Maybe the situation in Morocco is quite different to other countries or other groups of people as well. Why do you think well, in European narrative, the Second World War is such an important event? I mean, like in Holland, I think I discussed it in history class 3 times. How come that it's such a, maybe also because of course the scale might be smaller, but why is it not discussed, for instance, that the Gypsies were also part in the Second World War, or here in Morocco that these labor camps were there? Why is it not adapted in other countries?
In North Africa?
Yeah, for instance.
why they are not speaking about the camps
No, but
or about the war in Europe,
about the camps.
in North Africa?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. You know, they don't exist in any textbook, in anything. You know, Moroccans, they don't know about them. Only when you open documents, you see that they were camps. If you ask me why, I think because they remind these European camps of extermination and Nazi, and then if you mention them, you will draw a direct line to the Holocaust and the Jews, and you know, all the question that the dominant and official historical narrative don't want to deal with. You know, because you know, when you open your mouth in Morocco and you say, you know, there were camps and they put some Jews there, they put also Muslims, but some Jews, they look at you in different way, you know. So which in different way, I mean that they looked at you as like someone who has been paid to come and start to speak about these things in Morocco. But it's local history. There are few Moroccan historians in Morocco right now. That there are 3 or 4 of them, very known historians, very respected and serious, and they are trying to open this subject and talk about it. And if they started this story, so maybe it will take sometimes when people start to speak about it, not not in public, but at least in schools.
I think it's quite interesting. We also have after World War II, the Netherlands kind of invaded Indonesia, I guess, and we committed a lot of very horrible things. We don't learn anything about that in school. Like, it's really kind of a locked part in our history that there's also now quite a big movement trying to, I don't know, get it out there. It's really weird, especially so close after World War II, that's what we went and did in Smollett and other parts. But yeah, it's interesting that like this, like World War II and the camps and whatever are so stressed in Europe, but not in North Africa. While we are kind of forgetting about our own bad history, I guess. But I think it's interesting to see still the similarities between countries.
A few days ago, we were at the Ghetto Fighters Museum in Galilee, and our guide told us that the labor camps in Morocco, they were particularly inhabited by non-Moroccan Jews. My question is, what is so different? What was so different a few decades later, when Moroccan Jews fled to Israel, while a few decades before they were protected against the Nazis?
They were camps not only in Morocco. They were in Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, and Algeria. And in the camp by the name of Jado, I think it's here. From this one, they deported Libyan Jews from this one to European camps. You know, I think they deported them even to Auschwitz, if I'm not mistaken, but not all of them. Some of them. From the other camps in Tunisia and Morocco, they didn't deport anybody. So there were some different cases. There were some Gaullists or some anti-Nazis who were sent from Europe to these camps. Or there were also some cases from some Jews who run away from Europe to cross to America or South America, and then they stopped in Morocco to wait for the ferry, and then they were caught and they were put in these camps. So it is a local North African story with World War II and with their face to Europe. It's any connection between this and what happened here in Israel with the Jews coming from Europe, running away from the Shoah, and created the state of Israel on the expense of the expense of the Palestinians. Any connection will be really wrong, ethically and politically and also historically. So you should look at this as a local North African story, each case by itself, without trying to connect it. I know that when there are some students coming from Europe, or when you visit some museums and memorial sites, they try to connect these two episodes, but I think they are connectable. But I think if you have some integrity, you don't have to integrate to connect them.
The question was different.
Yeah.
So the question was about when does the Moroccan society is divorced from its Jewish community? So they are protecting them in the early 40s, but then they let them go or encourage them to leave, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In the 40s, you mean?
In the 40s, during this Second World War, they were protected. The Moroccan king protected the Jews from against the Nazis. But a few decades later, I think it was the 50s,
in the 60s,
when they left for Israel.
Yeah, but in the 60s is also another story. The king protects this religious group not because they were Jews and he liked them. He protected them because they were Moroccan subjects in very specific Moroccan historical context. In the 60s, another story. The Jews want to leave because they identify with the state of Israel, and they were not connected. Nobody could hold them. Even the king, his son, not Hassan II, he helped them. He was even paid by Israel to let them go. So he didn't stop them. So you can protect someone now, but in 10 years, the conditions, the political conditions change, and you change your behavior. So it's not because they were Jewish, because they were a religious group, minority in Morocco, and as a commander of faithful, he has to protect them, in order not to lose his legitimacy, and he protected them. Did I answer this question?
Kind of, but it was also we all had to read the book of Ari Shafid, My Promised Land, for this study trip, and he described it as in the 60s there was anti-Jewish sentiment in most of the Arab countries because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and because there was issues here in this land, it transported itself to Arab countries, and there Jews were being persecuted, and then they fled to Israel. I'm not sure if this was the same for Morocco or this only.
No, it is. It is similar in Morocco as well. The Jews in Morocco, most of them they identified themselves with what was going on here. So if you read the press, Moroccan press, the Muslim press, and the Jewish press, you will see that there are a war of discourses in these two kind of newspapers. The Jews were identified with the issue, the Jewish issue here in Palestine, and the Moroccan nationalists were identified with the Palestinians. There were volunteers from Morocco who came here to fight on both sides. The Jews fought with the Jews, and the Muslims fought with the Muslims. So it's true that that's what was one of the reasons that these two communities, I don't like the word communities, these two groups, they split at certain moment. The World War II was one of the main event that caused this cleavage, if you want, between the two.
And hence, during the following 2 decades, when the State of Israel was created.
Yeah, there were so many things that happened. I choose here in this context. I choose only one story. That's of the soldier, the Moroccan soldier who went to fight with France against Germany, but only Muslim soldiers, not Jewish soldiers. So when they came back from Europe, from the war, they had some solidarity, but there were no Jews there. Not because they were coward, like the French said, but because the French authority didn't want to send Jews and Muslims to fight in France. They turned the Jews down, and they took only the Muslims. So when they came back, this solidarity, which happened normally, which takes place normally during the war, in the war you become friends. Especially in this context, they become friends around one idea is to kick the French and become an independent state. But the Jews were not with them. There were so many different episodes that caused this, separation. One of them is this: to come back from Europe and then you don't find any Jewish soldiers that he can be identified with the idea of the independent state. So their mind, let's say, their mind was here, if you ask me my opinion. So they were thinking about coming here, but not. Some of them, the communists, were actually thinking to create independent Moroccan state and stay there, but not the majority.
Our time is really over, so I first would like to thank all three speakers. I think they gave us very different perspectives on the question of memory and reconciliation. What does it mean to think about the war as an Israeli Jewish author? How do Israeli and Palestinian, Zionist and Palestinian narratives conflict and interact? And also, what does it mean for Moroccans today to think about the past of Jewish communities? So what I would like to do now is, Sasha is very eager to have you meet our students as well, and to show you around campus. And to take advantage of the, 40 minutes of daylight that you still have.
I think it's less.
Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you.